Perfect. Thanks, Jess. So this conversation today started off as a bit of an interesting Slack conversation that Emily and myself were having around this kind of emerging intersection between design and policymaking and the importance of stories within that. And as we started talking about how interesting this intersection is, we started seeing other people are interested in this as well. So rather than keeping it in Slack, we wanted to open up this kind of coffee chat and lunchtime conversation to anyone else who is interested and is keen to hear more about the work that Beth and Emily are doing as I was. We'll hear more about this in just a few moments, but as we officially kick off this conversation together, I'd like to start by taking a moment to think about where we're located here in space, on country, where we're calling in from, and just to kind of connect with the land that we're on and pay respects to the traditional owners of that land. If you don't know who is living on the land where you are before colonization, there's two great links that Jess is going to pop in the chat. And one of them is a really beautiful interpretation for an Australian context. And the other is out of this great research group in Canada that's trying to undertake a kind of global understanding of the changing ownership and traditional custodians all over the world. So no matter where you're calling in from, there's something from everyone. And I myself am calling in from the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and the Wurrung people of the Kulin Nations in Naarm and Melbourne, Victoria. And I would like to pay my respect to the elders past and present and to their rich and continued tradition of connection to the place where I am lucky enough to be a settler. And in this place that's known as Australia, there's such an important tradition of storytelling. Indigenous people have been sustaining culture and community and connection to place through storytelling for more than 60,000 years. And despite sometimes systemic attempts to silence those stories. And so because of this, it feels really important to us in this conversation that's honoring stories and investigating how they can inform design and policy, that we really acknowledge this history and the privilege that we have to be here today discussing what it takes to design with stories in ethical ways. So as we have our conversation, and perhaps in your ongoing engagement with storytelling and stories, we would like to offer for you to keep in mind whose stories are being told and in what ways and to what end. Something to keep with you and hopefully take away. Great to see where everyone's coming in from on the chat. Thank you for sharing that. Love to see a Zoom chat popping off already. So a few webinar housekeeping items. We're going to have time for questions after hearing a bit about Beth and Emily's work. So if you'd like to ask those questions as they arise in the chat, Jess is also going to be sharing a link to an app called Mentimeter. And what this will do is it will let you ask questions and it will let other people see what questions have been asked and upvote. So that you don't have to only use the Zoom chat and those reactions. We can kind of see where there's energy and interest in the group. We'll be using those questions that are asked, hopefully as part of a blog that Beth and Emily and Jess and myself are going to be putting together, kind of summarizing some of the themes and insights that come up from the conversation. So we'll remind you of this again at the end. But if you're asking a question, just keep in mind that we might use some of that language and framing in a blog that we'd like to post. So please think about if you're happy for that to be shared as you ask questions. This is a lunchtime conversation, so bring your lunches, do your walk around and your stretches, come as you are. We will be recording this conversation. This conversation is being recorded, so please feel free to have videos on or off, however you're comfortable. And as we have more of a question and answer towards the end, we'll invite you to come off video, but there won't be any sort of spontaneous audience participation. Nobody's being called on, so get comfy, get settled in. And we'll have a conversation about storytelling. So Jess and myself are with the Center for Public Impact. We're a not-for-profit organization that supports government, philanthropy, and civil society organizations across the globe to kind of reimagine government so that it works better for everyone. And our interest in storytelling is really stemming from this belief that in order for government to work better for everyone, it requires different ways of not only doing things differently, but also being differently, learning to listen and valuing different ways of knowing. We've been working with partners like Hands Up Mali and Düsseldorf Forum for a couple of years now around the importance of stories to community and systems change. They have produced a report around storytelling for systems change that some of you might already be familiar with. And in the next phase of work, they're looking less at the sort of supply side of stories and more about the demand of what constitutes like a readiness to listen to stories in government. What does that look like, and how do we create that sort of appetite? And amidst all those conversations that have been happening, Emily and myself have been connecting with our design backgrounds, and I have been so keen to learn more about the work that's being done at this sort of emerging intersection of designing and policy and storytelling, which is why we're here today with Emily MacLoud and Beth Hyland, who are senior and lead design strategists with Portable Design Studio, and having this conversation today. So thank you for joining. Ask questions as you'd like in the chat, and we'll have time to address them towards the end. And to kick things off, I have a few questions for you, Beth and Emily, and I believe you have some stories of your own and some examples of work that you'll be sharing with us today. Brilliant. So I'd like for us to just start by introducing yourself in your own words and telling us a bit about who you are, the work that you're doing, and if you'd like, what initially sparked your interest in storytelling. And Beth, I'd love to start with you, if that's okay.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ali. So excited to see so many faces on the call this morning to have a conversation about storytelling. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about Portable, which is the company that Emily and I work for, as they feel very related in this topic of storytelling. So firstly, a little bit about myself. I'm someone who has been passionate about change and social change for a long time, maybe as long as I can remember almost. Really interested in that and have pursued that through my studies. I started out in social science and environmental science, and then I moved into, I did some study of governance. I did a master's in strategic foresight, and have worked in the public sector, but more recently in the impact sector. Because somewhere along that journey, I stumbled across human-centered design and thought, this is an incredible methodology, and I can see the real power of this to make change. So yeah, I came across design and then have worked in design for impact, so design to make social change, to try and improve people's lives, make a difference, for about 10 years now. And that includes my role as a strategic design lead at Portable. So Portable's mission is all about seeking out areas of social need and policy failure, and then using design and technology as tools to help address challenges in those spaces. So in really practical terms, that could mean a whole range of different things. It could mean that we create some kind of digital product or platform or something in the digital sphere, but we also do work around things like design research and kind of discovering different problems and coming up with solutions that are in the offline world as well, and sort of everything in between. Some of the big focuses at Portable are things like the mental health space, as well as the justice space, as well as the education space, whole range of other sectors outside of that as well, but those are a few of the big ones. My interest in storytelling, at the risk of, I feel like I'm really starting to go on for a long time now, but my interest in storytelling has really probably come into my work before I really fully started to become aware of it. So I think through things like empathy and listening, and which are core to human-centered design processes, the real need to kind of tune in to people's stories. And one of the things I'm most interested in is not just the story itself, but all of the meaning that our stories bring with them. And I think that's part of the reason that I'm really interested in storytelling as a method for learning, as a method for change, and as a method for kind of building shared understanding as well. That's probably enough from me.
Thanks so much, Beth. I really love that description of like becoming aware of an interest in storytelling. Yeah, and then the way that it links up with human-centered design and some of those behaviors and skills that are almost inherent to that design process, when done well, at least. Thanks, Emily. Same question.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks, Beth. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm zooming in from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And in terms of my story, my background is in law, and I have been exploring how to use design to improve the world of law for a few years now. And in particular, I was drawn to design and design research because I really love to listen to people's problems and their hopes and their dreams and their stories, and try and make sense of those and bring about change in order to make an impact in their lives. And what really gets me going when I am engaging people in interviews or in workshops is when they provide a little anecdote or a little story about an experience that they've had in the past. And that story has been able to then like highlight a problem that they're experiencing that words alone cannot. And that storytelling that they share, that is the thing that really makes me feel, really makes me have empathy for what they're going through, and the impact of their context on them. And so I've I guess been really interested in individual stories for a number of years. But last year, what got the ball rolling for me was coming along to the session that was run by CPI, where they started talking about using storytelling for systems change. And that sort of broadened my horizon in terms of, oh, it's not just individual stories, but actually we can use stories in a bigger way to sort of start to create change, start to change the systems that we're embedded within. And since that session that was hosted, I've been exploring how to use it in my day-to-day, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the projects that we've worked on at Portable, but just sort of a couple of reflections. What I've seen is that the difference typically between a junior in our studio and a senior or a lead is their ability to tell a story. It's that ability to really communicate sort of what is happening for the client, or what we've heard within our projects about the change that users want to see. So that's one reflection, and the importance of storytelling within design. And then the second reflection is that I've really seen storytelling be the bridge between designs being useful and relevant and implemented, and designs falling down a big black hole, never to be picked up again. So storytelling is super duper important for our context because of the work that we do at Portable. So it's really exciting to be here today and a little bit about storytelling in the policy context.
Thank you so much, Emily. And I love how even in talking about our connection to storytelling, we're starting to talk about things like how you communicate the impact and value of work, how you share anecdotes about past lived experiences. And something that's really coming up is the way that these stories can not only kind of inform and inspire the work that we're doing or the design solutions we're proposing, but they almost require a responsibility on our part as someone who's heard a story and listened to a story to kind of honor and act upon stories in a way that just reading a report or seeing some data around might not necessarily carry with it. So I'm curious to unpack just for a few minutes, what do we think the difference is between, say, like a story and just like communicating, or like qualitative data and data generation, like more broadly? Like what makes something a story or a storytelling approach?
I can start on this one. It's a really interesting one to try and tease out. I think one of the things that really stands out to me, and I think I sort of touched on this a little bit in my introduction, is the sort of implicit meaning that stories bring with them. So when someone shares a story with you, there is an emotional reasoning behind that story, and there is all of this context around what happened, why, and what it meant to that person that you've got to be pretty sensitive to when you're listening to it. And often good practice to kind of check in with a person to check that you're understanding the meaning behind their story well. And I think that understanding that sort of the context around a story helps you to then communicate it to somebody else and see the connection between different people's stories. And I'd say one of the key differences I would see between like more qualitative information or things that are, I'm going to say, more dry material is the obvious presence of that emotional reasoning within a story. And it is the sense of significance that is kind of attached to it. And I think it's one of the things that makes stories really powerful is that, you know, in a world that can sometimes be very rational, a story can actually cut through when that emotional element to it and that subtext resonates with other people, and you understand the information that's communicated in a story in a very different way to when you understand a list of facts, because there's all of this context and all of these sort of subtleties that are tied up in the story. I think the other thing that I would say is that stories, I think, tend to either confirm or challenge our ideas about how the world is and what's possible. So sometimes we listen to stories that are really comforting because the rhythm to them makes a lot of sense, and it's sort of like it starts in a place we sort of expect, and there might be some tension in the middle, but it resolves itself in a way that's sort of familiar and comforting. But then there are those stories that start, begin, and end in places that are unexpected. And I think those stories that challenge us are some of the most powerful, because they kind of expand our perceptions about what might be possible. They can engage our empathy, and they can allow us to reason in different ways. And I think it's quite different the way that stories do that compared to the way that a factual piece of information or something that's just a report does.
Yeah, definitely. And just to jump off where one of the points, Beth, that you were making, you know, there is this storytelling formula that we've all come across. Every story has a beginning, middle, and an end. And there's some great work that's been done to unpick that formula and to use those components to communicate and engage people. And I just wanted to highlight an article that I've come across recently that I absolutely love, by Sam Villas. And in that, it sort of talks about the different components of a story and how to sort of set up a workshop to engage participants to create stories of their own. And so I think that is a really good way of thinking about, you know, what's the difference between qualitative data and a storytelling approach. It's that formula that comes with it. And then there's also, a number of other frameworks and templates that consultancies have created that help their clients to communicate messages more clearly. And I also want to share this fantastic resource from Stronger Stories, which is an outfit in the UK that has created what they've called their lean story canvas. And that is a great tool just for identifying what's the message that you want to communicate, and then having some prompts to bring that story to life. And those are just sort of a couple of, I guess, materials that can be used to think about sort of a different storytelling approach. But I kind of don't want to go down that path, and I want to sort of take us on a different tangent. So the three things that I'm really interested in talking about is the fact that, this is an obvious statement, that stories are both a means of knowing and a method of telling. And for me, until I got that in my head, I always thought of storytelling as a method of telling, but stories can also be used as a means of making sense of the world around us. And they can also be used as a means of pulling different story threads together to make up one big story. It's about trying to use storytelling to find the bridges between why people might do what they do, or why a system might operate in the way that it does. And I just thought that was quite an interesting framing of the different ways that we could use stories. That second point is thinking through the fact that stories are really central to our means of communicating, both with ourselves, the stories that we tell ourselves, and also with one another. Everything that we take in is in story form, and we're often relating back the things that we hear to our own context. And Beth, you mentioned this before, that it's really the key difference between sort of stories and qualitative data is those emotive elements. It's stories are really useful to engage people emotionally and make information more accessible. And I think too that this is why, and we've seen it in the robo-debt scandal recently, why stories are used strategically, especially in sort of political settings, because they can be so effective at influencing policy and public attitudes, because they are so accessible and emotionally engaging. And I guess the third way in which they're different from qualitative data is that stories can grow. They're not static. They don't necessarily, or they're not necessarily a piece of information that is disconnected from the world around it. They're dynamic, and I think a really great example of a storytelling approach that I've come across recently is by the Narrative Initiative, that talks about a metaphor of using waves to think about a model for deep narrative change. And Ali, you were the one who put me onto this to begin with, but they use this metaphor of a big ocean, and stories are on top of the ocean. It's the choppiness. It's what we can see. But underneath the surface layer are the narratives, and they're the currents that are sort of driving up what is happening on the ocean's surface. And stories are in this way sort of making sense of the narratives that are sitting underneath. It's making that narrative relatable and accessible and personable, personal to folks. And so I just feel like those 3 points, I guess, are a good place to start the conversation, to get us thinking about the ways in which stories are a bit different from just regular old qualitative data collection. And there's a few materials there as well to really hone in on what a storytelling approach could look like.
I love being in conversation with designers where the things that we talk about can become visual, which makes it so lovely to see the different points. But I can see, especially in the last 2 points, like the almost sense of scale that stories are acting within. So talking about like the role of storytelling as sense making for ourselves. So like we know that work around like narrative therapy of like, what's the story that you're telling yourself about this? And what is that based on? And how do you speak to that story? And is it worth challenging and reframing? And then also the way that you get to tell your story to others and have it be listened to. And Emily, like you started to talk about the role of stories in reinforcing or in shifting the sort of broader narratives that are occurring. Before we continue to some of the work that you've been doing around this and how this is playing into the design process and policymaking, there's something interesting in what we were discussing earlier, Beth, as well, around like the rhythm of storytelling and what's familiar about it and reassuring, but then also what's challenging in different contexts. And when you were talking about the emotion, I could see several comments in the chat emphasizing like, yeah, storytelling is about the emotion, but I'm wondering if that's also something that makes it so difficult to be accepted in certain contexts and to be acted upon and to be seen as an important, valid way of understanding.
Yeah, I think it's very true. And I think something I've been reflecting on as we've been discussing this is just how stories are also a tool for inclusion or exclusion, and how they can be a means of creating a sense of belonging and a sense of shared understanding. And to link this back to the work in the social change space, I feel like often when we're looking at a system or a problem, what we need to do in order to solve that problem really effectively is bring together people who have different perspectives and different experiences with that challenge, and have a conversation that is inclusive of those different perspectives, because that's where you get the best solutions. And I'm thinking of an example of working in the mental health space and in the mental health system. And one of the challenges being that when people's perspectives are disconnected from each other and there's been a bit of a loss of trust, creating environments where people feel included is difficult, because people have such different stories about what's going on and why. And I'm remembering back to a co-design workshop that we set up that had both mental health practitioners and people with lived experience in the same room together. And one of the things that we did to help set that environment up was to tell a bit of a story about what was going on in the mental health sector based on things that we'd heard. So there was some time to build up to this conversation, but essentially what we needed to do is represent and honour the different stories present in the sector. So it was things like saying, for mental health practitioners, they are often feeling under a lot of pressure and a lot of stress and working really hard to hold the system together. And alongside that truth, it's also true that people with lived experience have had terrible and traumatic experiences, not universally, but that has happened, and that have not always got the help that they needed when they're in some of the most difficult circumstances of their life. So I haven't told that story perfectly beautifully this time around, but essentially something that is able to represent and honor the truth of everyone in a way that makes it a little bit safe, a little bit safer. Still courage required for people to engage in those spaces, but to essentially say, we're not favoring this narrative over this narrative. We're saying, here are two stories, and here is an opportunity for kind of coming together and finding a pathway forward. And yeah, I think stories can be amazingly powerful because even though, as you were saying, Ali, the act of like bringing emotion into spaces can be a little bit uncomfortable or challenging. If you ignore it, people sit with a kind of silent tension, and it makes it very difficult to have a real conversation.
I love acknowledging that the stories are always there, even if they're not being invited to be shared and they're not being listened to. They still exist and they still inform the context and what's happening. Thank you for sharing that. I think alongside that truth, it's also true might be a new tattoo or a new motto for me. When working in that sort of a space where you're holding multiple and sometimes conflicting and intention truths and experiences, and needing to kind of work through and come up with an outcome or a solution. Designers love solutions, bless our hearts. I'd be curious to hear a bit more about your own work and like, how do we do this? Like, what are the tools and the methods that we're using? What does it look like in action? And I know that you have some stories and some slides to share with us.
I'm happy to kick us off, Beth. So when we were preparing for this webinar, we got together and we were thinking, well, when do we use stories, especially within the context of policy design? And Beth and I were thinking about these three moments. So that first circle is around when the policy direction is unknown. That second moment is when the policy direction might be flexible, but there is a certain direction that needs to be taken that has been agreed upon. And then that third circle is relating to when the policy direction has been agreed to, and how stories are used as a way of engaging people along that policy change journey. So with reference to the different stories that we're going to share, we have tried to touch on three different projects that address these three different points. That first circle around when a policy direction is unknown. As designers, we enter a discovery phase, and we're often using stories to gather ideas for what that policy should be. And there are a range of different techniques to uncover that, anecdotal circles being one. And in that phase of work, it's really exciting because there are just so many different perspectives, and the world is your oyster. We, enable people to think blue sky, and stories can be a really great way to help people come up with ideas about different ways that they would love to, or different futures that they would like to see. That second circle, when the policy direction is flexible, is typically a phase of work that we call define, where we are using stories to either validate or challenge whether or not a policy direction is going to be appropriate for the context. And that third circle, when the policy direction has been agreed upon, that's typically our design phase, where we have an idea and we're testing that idea with a bunch of people. People's realities are so complex. Oftentimes it's really hard to know what their values are or what's important to them, or really sort of understand the dimensions of their different realities. And so stories can be a really great way to elicit sort of an understanding about what those values are. Beth, did you want to come in at this point and share a little bit about these three phases?
Yeah, I think you've summarized it pretty well there. I think the only thing I would add is, like, I think you can start a design process from any one of these 3 points as well. So depending on your level of certainty and clarity about the change that's needed, stories are still relevant, regardless of whether the policy direction is unknown and there's more openness, or whether it's clearer and you've got a stronger sense of what might need to happen, or if you're somewhere in between. I think any of these 3 places can be good starting points, and there's some good flexibility in design methods and approaches, which is one of the things we love about it, is that you can sort of start anywhere. I'm sorry, I might start with an example. I'll talk a little bit about some work I was involved in, which was in an environment where the policy direction is already kind of decided, and there's knowledge about the change that we want to make. So it's related to sustainability. And I think this is a good example of an area where there are some very strong narratives, some very entrenched, wicked challenges tied up in this. More specifically, the context was around the people's home buying and building choices, and how that relates to kind of carbon emissions. So the idea that we want to see people buying and building homes that are better insulated, use less energy, better for them, kind of better for the environment. And there are a few little images on this slide that kind of tell you the story and what we were kind of engaging with to begin with. So there was this idea that this kind of standoff between salespeople, home buyers, and builders. And this is how the problem is explained to us. So that there are salespeople who sell inefficient homes, so energy inefficient homes that can be cold and hot easily, can be drafty, can be not that comfortable to live in, and require a lot of energy to keep running. And then you have home buyers who are building these inefficient homes, and you have home builders who are building the homes that are not particularly efficient. And when we explored this story a little bit more, what we heard is essentially everyone in this situation is making their decisions based on money. So it's cheaper for people to buy homes that are less energy efficient. So it's easier for salespeople to sell them cheaper homes. And then the builders need to do what the buyers and the salespeople are asking them to do, and build the inefficient homes. But what's interesting in this story is we heard that nobody is ultimately really happy with this outcome. So home buyers are having less satisfaction when they move into their house. There's a little picture in the bottom there where people are cold because the home that they bought isn't very comfortable to live in. The builders also don't really believe, that they've built the best home for people. So there's not a lot of pride or satisfaction in that. And salespeople also know that they're selling people not necessarily the best product. So this was brought to us as kind of like a bit of an intractable problem. And what we questioned here was really like this narrative about what's going on and why. And we said, is money really the absolute deciding factor? I think in, if I can say this, in capitalism broadly, I think money is a really easy story to tell. It simplifies things right down, kind of like basically it comes back to the dollars. That's what everybody cares about. But we dug a little bit deeper into this story and started to question it a bit more and say, well, what if this is actually a story about people making a really big, important purchase for themselves, where they don't completely understand the thing that they're buying, and maybe don't understand completely what's possible here, which is another popular story, is like people don't have the information and don't know, which can be quite a reductive way of thinking about things as well. But essentially what we did is say, what if we introduced a new narrative into this space and kind of changed the way that stories are being told, and then see how receptive people are to it. So on the next slide, we've got a little Monopoly board, because what we did was we thought about, if this is a big, important purchase for people, how could we kind of engage people more fully in thinking about this purchasing decision and what its implications might be for them. And if we could have this story in a way that helps them have choice about what their home might look like, we might lead to better sustainability outcomes. And we drew on some methods and some knowledge here around things like behavioral science. We looked at the architecture of choice. So that idea that when you present people with options, that helps them to make decisions, and you don't want to present them with too many options because that's overwhelming. But a few options gives them the ability to kind of compare and contrast things. So what we did is we recruited people who are in the process of buying or building a home to try and make this as realistic as possible. And then we brought them in for a little experiment and simulated a sales conversation to say, imagine you're in the middle of the home buying process at the moment. We heard a bit about their story with that. And then we put in front of them a little scenario of, imagine, here's your budget. You've talked about what your budget is. Here are some options of what your housing could be like. Here are some pros and cons of each. And we essentially walked them through a process. We were telling them a story about what their home buying journey and outcome could look like, gave them choices along the way, and gave them that opportunity to think more deeply about it. And even though it was a simulated purchasing decision, so we can't in some ways put too much weight on the outcome, we did find that through that process, 94% of the people that we engaged in that chose sustainability features that would make their home more energy efficient and better, more comfortable for them to live in, and also better for the environment as well, which was a really surprising outcome for the people who brought this problem to us in the first place, because this assumption was that money was everything. And what we found is, with those people who made this choice, many of them money, what was the insight here was that many of them bought into the sustainability features, even though there was a greater cost to them. So money was not the sole or even the biggest motivating factor. And when you engaged with them and their story on a personal level, you begin to see the nuances in this and the actual things that are important to people. That was a lot from me. Emma, I think you've got another example to follow on.
Yeah, excellent. And feel free to jump in, Beth. So the next example is some work that we've done recently in the family violence space. And we worked with stakeholders across Australia, from the family court, from police and child protection agencies, to understand whether or not we could make information sharing easier and more efficient amongst those agencies. And what was particularly interesting about this project is that we adopted that framing around stories being both a way to make sense of what we were hearing, and then also stories being a way of telling. So in terms of making sense of what we were, or the context that we were trying to engage with, we carried out, very standard design research activities like interviews and workshops. And across those engagements, we were really there to listen initially and not challenge what we were hearing. We also started to hear a number of the same stories from different stakeholders and could see how those stories were all feeding into a overarching narrative about information sharing and where the problems were within the system. And it meant that what we needed to do as we were listening to these stories was sort of accept the status quo, and I guess like take their word for it. It's sort of about suspending belief at that initial stage where you're just trying to understand what's going on for them. It also helped us to sort of understand where there may be some potential opportunities. Beth, did you want to come in at that point and talk about our listening to stories phase?
What do I want to say here? I think there's something in this idea of not challenging people's stories and having a level of trust that when we go into this environment, people will share with us what is relevant and true for them. And I think trusting people's stories is important because, firstly, it's a little bit of a way of building trust with them as we become familiar with their reality and what's going in that world, in their world. And I think it's important that that precedes challenging them. So I think there are some things that we started to notice culturally around things like risk and real hypersensitivity to risk. And that kind of points to some deeper stories that are present in the space. But I think it's only until you've started to, you've got to start by really accepting, listening to, taking on board the way that people are presenting what's going on before you have a little bit of permission to ask some questions that might challenge their reality a little bit.
Yeah, thanks, Beth. And so then as the project went on, we were starting to make sense of those stories that we were hearing and starting to tell our own stories. And one of the techniques that we used was speculative design to awaken the imaginations of those stakeholders in the room, to make them, I guess, explore what might be possible in a way that was humanizing and safe and relatable. And we used comics for that purpose. And I think what was quite interesting about that technique was that it really did quite quickly enable people to see what a possible future could involve. But what was interesting was that it highlighted, at least for me, this real risk of how stories can narrow people's views about what could be possible. It also highlighted that there are some times where stories can, if you don't have the essence clear enough, people can kind of get caught up with the specific details that you include in the story, and can actually detract people away from what you're actually trying to get across. And I think ultimately too, when you are telling stories in that context, you really do need a bit of context for how those stories are landing for people. Beth, did you want to jump in there and share a little bit about those activities too?
Be for you to keep rolling, Em.
Yeah, excellent. So then the last example that we're going to go through is a project that we worked on with Origin and RMIT students. And on this project, we looked at co-designing new interactive experiences for ChatSafe. And what was particularly interesting about this content is that it was quite heavy. The material was looking at ways in which we could help students to explore suicide in a safe way, and talk about sort of the feelings that come up to people when they're in this sort of heightened state. And what I thought was quite interesting about this is that the tool that we used were these sort of concept posters and comic strips. And by using something that was a little bit more visual, but still had a sort of storytelling element to it, it enabled people to engage in the material in a way that they could sort of put boundaries between their own experiences and the actual topic that was being discussed. And again, when storytelling is mixed in with, well, storytelling is both using words, but can also be used, visuals can also be used to tell a story. And I think that this was sort of a great combination of the two of those different forms of storytelling. So those were a few of our examples. Beth, did you have any other thoughts, takeaways?
I'm curious whether Ali has questions.
Well, not only do I have questions, but looking at the Mentimeter, there are lots of very good questions that are being asked by the audience. So something that I was initially kind of keen about is like, how do we know that we're doing this well? How do we know when things could be going wrong? And I think you've started to kind of touch on that. But before we delve into some of the even more rich and juicy questions that were being asked by the audience, I would love if we can touch on that just briefly. What does it look like? What does it feel like when this is going well? And what is something that could go wrong with storytelling from some of your experiences?
So I'm happy to kick this off.
Yeah, go for it.
So in terms of red flags to look out for, I would certainly say when stories are used without considering the context or the audience of those stories. I would also say like a big red flag is when those stories are disconnected and we haven't necessarily been able to outline what is the narrative. We're unable to see sort of what the bigger picture is. I would also say that stories can be quite divisive, and they can sometimes reinforce stereotypes or negative biases. And so being mindful of looking out for those. And then closely linked with that, it's what is our role in telling those stories. We need to be mindful of sort of the power dynamics at play between those who are listening to stories, then retelling those stories, and then the storyteller's relationship with the audience as well.
That's something I really loved about. Sorry, that was something I loved about that third example that you were sharing, is it kind of closes the loop, right? So you're not just broadcasting stories at people, you're also seeing how is that landing, how is it resonating, how is that connecting to the deeper kind of cultural narrative and challenging or resonating. So that's, yeah, I think that was a great nuance you added in that third example. Were you adding 100%. More? I'm sorry to cut you off.
No. I was just to say, like, and this is a very good example, like being open to feedback and being and letting one person's story be a jumping off point for another person's story, and creating a safe space so that people are willing to share feedback and critique.
Yeah, I think there's something I want to build off on here, which is I'm just thinking about the importance of entering spaces where we're hearing people's stories with a real mindset of respect for the people who are sharing their story, and recognizing that it's a privilege when people share their stories with us, and it's not sort of a right or something we're entitled to, or something that should be transactional, where it's sort of, or not transactional, because sometimes that's okay, but I would say like not extractive, where there's only us taking the stories from someone. Ideally, it's something that you do where there is a value exchange, and somebody is sharing their story generously with you, and they get something in return. And sometimes that's just being listened to really well. Like I would say one of my signals that storytelling is going well, or the process is going well, is that I feel like I'm really tuned in and listening to the person who's sharing with me. And when I play back to them what I'm hearing from them, they agree with me, that's good, but also they correct me or they elaborate. Those are signs that someone's really, we're understanding this story and shaping this story together. And I think ideally we have methods that allow for people to provide that confirmation of storytelling, not just in the moment, but later on as well, and recognizing that stories kind of belong to those individuals and also potentially a community of people as well. So when we're talking about what someone's story is, that we're having that opportunity for people to feedback, correct, or validate the direction that we're going with storytelling, to make sure that we're not bringing our own biases and prejudices or the dominant narrative and imposing that on the stories that people are sharing with us.
And I love raising some of these considerations as like key core approaches in storytelling, because what that does is it requires a slower pace of working. It requires more feedback loops, and it requires not just brushing to say, well, we need to send this out by next week, so let's send it out, but actually like revisiting the stories and saying, does this sound right, and sharing back in a really transparent and reciprocal sort of way. So I love thinking about how stories in this approach and what that sort of like asks of us as researchers, design researchers, as people who are being trusted with these stories in these communities to get to do. We have questions. We have lots of questions. If you haven't already had the chance to upvote, there's a couple key, wow, it's such a close race. So we have a few key questions. Emily and Beth, are you able to see in the Mentimeter the questions, or shall I read them?
If you could read them, that would be helpful.
Brilliant. Okay, so the top one, as of the time that I am refreshing the screen, it's changing by the minute, is currently, are there any suggestions for working with decision makers that have a compelling but wrong story driving their thinking? I love the framing of this question. Whoever asked this question, would you like to elaborate a little bit more and come off mute and and elaborate more behind this question? Open invitation. There's no obligation.
Hello all. I hope you can hear me. Robbie Slope, I'm with the ACT government. I would just like to qualify my question too. By wrong story, I really mean that no story is wrong. I don't think anyone's view on their own reality is incorrect, but more that a decision maker is taking the faulty framework, faulty presumptions within that view perspective and applying that to their own decision making, if that makes sense.
Makes a lot of
Thanks,
sense.
Robbie.
Yeah, cool. I'll start because I've got some thoughts on this. So I think the first thing is like, might be a bit counterintuitive, but I think the place to start would be with compassion and recognizing that people in decision-making positions, while they might have a narrative that's misguided and maybe is causing some real damage as well, some poor decision-making impacting on other people, recognizing that, we're generally not wrong on purpose or like trying to do bad things to other people. So starting from a little bit of a place of compassion. And then I think as someone who wants to challenge that story, I think starting to test what openness there is to other perspectives. So I think kind of the one approach would be to come in and kind of correct the narrative or like tell a story that's very different. I think what often happens in those circumstances is that people will reject a story that they can't relate to at all. So like if there are some small ways to just test someone's openness to different ideas, different ways of thinking about things, ideally that might look like pulling up alongside them with some curiosity and listening to their story about what's going on. And maybe you notice like a small piece of contradictory information and say, I'm noticing that this is happening over here. I feel like that's maybe outside what we kind of understand at the moment. Can you see that as well? Or how do you make sense of that? And I think even though when I play it out, it sounds a little bit painful, I think there's something about understanding the way that someone is coming at the world, organizing their thinking, that allows you to meet them in the middle more. And if you have a sense of how much flexibility they have, because some people, when presented with new information, will actually, be really curious and be interested, whereas other people might sort of shut down. The more information you have about that, the easier it is to help shift that. And the other thing I would say, which is maybe a meta thing, is just like bringing them in on the process and giving them opportunity to be part of exploring, learning, understanding, having new information come to light, because it's partly the process of storytelling and that process of understanding things that helps us change our mind. So yeah, trying to provide some access to that process.
And just to reiterate everything that Beth said, I think that all sounds very sensible. There was a lovely conversation that I had with Fleury from Stronger Stories, and she was talking about the 3 principles that she always shares with her clients. And I thought it was really relevant here. So the first principle is that the strongest stories are the ones that we tell ourselves. The second principle is the only thing that can replace that story is a stronger one. And the third principle is it takes 1,000 stronger stories to change the narrative. And I think that there's something there around recognizing that a story that they're telling themselves is very different from the narrative. And then that narrative is also very different from like their values and worldviews. And so it's by trying to understand, well, what are those bridges between all of those aspects that make up that story? That's when you can kind of start to change it up and challenge it a little bit.
I love all of that. And I think we're really onto something about how we help those with wrong stories. But it's also, I'm curious about like where the curiosity and the questioning is coming from and the relationship to the person doing the questioning. Because I know like when a close friend asks a question of something that I'm saying, I'll take it with a lot more trust and knowing that they're coming from a place of good intention than somebody that I'm in an argument with on Twitter asking a question. It's not going to come off the same way. So just that idea of being able to build authentic relationships and the time that that takes and the trust that that takes, and thinking about like, what is your relationship to the person whose story you're engaging with? And I think that also creates willingness to kind of find the truth and the yes and in what they're saying and the kind of common ground there. Beth, are you going to add?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's really true. And I think that idea you shared of like the intention is really helpful. And if you can align with people on what the intention is and what it is that we're trying to achieve, which direction are we trying to go in, I think that's a really helpful enabler of stories and some more openness and some exploration, and digging a little deeper to that layer can be really helpful.
Emily, are you able to share the name of the person that defined those 3 principles? And also, as a note, we'll share back all of the resources shared in the chat and the recording of the webinar altogether. So don't feel like you're going to lose out on anything. Do you want to share that in the chat, if you get a chance?
Yeah, perfect.
Or we can send it after if it takes a bit of digging. Oh, brilliant. Great. So our next, oh wow, we have a new rising star. So the next question that's come to the very top of the list. In a world with dwindling attention spans, how do you adapt storytelling, which may be typically longer form, into something that is concise without losing these elements of emotion, meaning, etc.? Would whoever asked this question like to come off mute and elaborate a little bit more?
Yeah, happy to jump in there. I think it's definitely just a challenge. I think I'm sure a lot of us may know who have attempted a lot of this is, yes, with dwindling attention spans and longer form content becoming a lot harder to hold attentions throughout. And I think building narrative and really delving deep and being honest across the entire story, the entire narrative takes time. But in needing to do so in much shorter and more concise ways, just any piece of advice that you would say that can sort of help you really draw yourself down and remain concise without having to select parts of the story to include or exclude. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
What an excellent question. I think there are a bunch of different parts to that. The first thing that I am thinking about is the idea that our attention, to an extent, follows what our priorities are. And I think that this kind of goes back to that idea of like, what are people trying to achieve? Because I think we find this with, sort of where people make time and space in their day connects to what's important to them. I think you're also touching on a really important point around sort of just distractions and like people's like tendency to multitask. I think, being in a more virtual world means that we're more distracted more frequently. There's lots of information coming in. So I just want to name and validate that I think you're highlighting a genuine challenge here, and I don't want to be flippant about that. I think that there's something around the containers that we build for the exchange of story. So when I'm talking about containers, I'm sort of like that sense of connection and safety in that environment in which information has been, it can be exchanged. And there's a part of me that feels like ideally we don't compromise on what those containers look like. So if we need an hour to tell a story, we try and make the space for there to be an hour to tell the story. And then I think if that's not an option, I think maybe the choice is about building smaller containers and smaller moments of connection with still the end goal of building a shared understanding of a complete story. But I think if you can't tell the whole story from start to finish, maybe you tell the first piece of the story with a hope to piquing people's curiosity, getting them interested, and having them willing to re-engage at another point with another piece of the story. Obviously, a fair few variables about sort of like what context you're doing this in, what your format is, that kind of thing. I think there's part of me as well that wants to say there's like an element of relationship building that can go with storytelling as well. And I think because that connection is something that as people, we crave to different degrees, if you can find a way for it to be storytelling, but in a way that connects, and kind of going back to Em's point about, you know, storytelling, not just as a means of telling, but as a way of knowing. If there's an invitation for people to be part of the story, and this is not just them being on the receiving end of some information, but they are, being included in this process, then I think it becomes more meaningful for people, and you're more likely for them to engage and be active participants in that, and then sort of, make it a priority.
My only thought on that is recognizing that maybe we might not have the capacity for a narrative, but we might have a capacity for a story. And so can we have lots of different little stories that all relate to a one overarching narrative, and then trying to sort of make the links there. But I think all of the advice that Beth has given is really solid as well. Yeah.
We also have some comments coming in around the visual role that can happen in terms of inclusivity and kind of the illustrative and the visual, and making it more even more easy to engage with, and things that people can kind of buy into. It becomes their own narrative as well. Great crowdsourcing seems like a good way to think about how we create stories that command more. Great. Sorry, now I'm just reading all the comments coming in. Lots of great responses to that. Great. So the third question that I've been waiting to get to ask is, I am curious how to handle clients who are highly quantitative and data centric, and who tend to shut down conversations and stories around qualitative research, saying, well, that's just an anecdote. And I love the framing of that question as we start our conversation, saying like, what's the difference between qualitative research and stories? And our stories are so much more emotional, and they have rhythms, and they're culturally embedded. And it's like qualitative research plus emotion and softness and all these sort of things that are seen as invalid. And then in this question, it's saying that the qualitative research is kind of being shut down. So it's even a level, a more accepted, rigorous level above storytelling is still being challenged. So I absolutely love, and I feel the tension and the challenge that's being asked in this question. Whoever asked this question, would you like to speak to the context and elaborate a little bit more before we take a stab at it and crowdsource some responses as well?
Hi, folks. Yeah, that was my question. I feel that the previous questions have kind of overlapped with this, and some of the answers from colleagues have been really good, sort of suggesting extra steps or practices to bring in. I think my question was sort of centered around, perhaps you already, you kind of know that there's a pattern with this decision maker or client, that they're very KPI driven, and you're trying to turn this sort of big KPI tanker around. And perhaps there could be a story that's on the outer, but really needs to be brought to the center, because it could be that thing that everyone's overlooking that's going to make a big difference. So keen to hear your thoughts.
It's a really good question as well. I will share some things that are coming up for me. So I think we've touched on this a little bit at other points as well, but I think that principle of like seeking first to understand before being understood. So like the more you can dig into and understand what motivates that quantitative mindset, what are the kind of parameters, what are the ways that they think about data and information, the easier it will be to find a way in. So I'm thinking like, you know, in statistics, you know, there are concepts about, you know, what the average is and different ways of displaying information and data that make outliers more or less important. And I feel like there might be something interesting in that to explore. Maybe that's a way into sharing a story, and like essentially framing what you're trying to do into language that the person that you're speaking to is more familiar with. I'm thinking a little bit as well about the power of when qualitative and quantitative information is combined. And maybe if your interest is in the outliers, maybe a place to start would actually be in helping to confirm a story that's already known, even though that might be a bit uncomfortable. But if they've got the data telling a story, maybe there's a way that qualitative information could be an offer to them to help bring that quantitative data to life and help confirm that story. And then once you've co-created that, people start to see the value in the qualitative information. And maybe then that's an opportunity to then challenge them with an outlier piece of information and say, this feels really significant and this is different to the sort of the story that we're telling. How do we make sense of what this means? And, you know, maybe they'll say, well, we dismiss it because it's an outlier. But then you say, maybe this piece of information feels like it should have a bigger weighting, though. Like we've got 100 data points, but maybe they're only worth 1 point. And this one that I'm looking at, to me, this feels like this is should be weighted at like 200, which is bigger than our whole mainstream story. So maybe there's some kind of way of speaking their language a little bit in communicating, the value of qualitative. And I think, you know, when you've had an experience of qualitative information being really useful, I think that's the thing that kind of changes the game for people when you've actually had a bit of a shift in perspective yourself. Some thoughts from me. That's all.
Thanks, Beth. And I've just also shared in the chat a really interesting article that I came across recently that, and I think actually it was an article that was shared in an article that CPI produced. And the article is called Moving to a World Beyond, like the P score, basically, statistical significance. And I think it has a really lovely set of principles in that article, which I think are useful in conversations with people around the around challenging just using quantitative data. I think it can be used to highlight that even if something is considered statistically significant, it may not necessarily have weight to it, or it needs to be a little bit needs to be challenged a bit further. We can't just take scores and statistics and quantitative data at face value. We need to kind of explore a bit deeper. And I think that, yeah, their principles are accepting uncertainty, being thoughtful, being open, and being modest, which I think is a good takeaway. That quant data.
I think this morning I was in conversation with the Fiona called Orange Compass, and she was saying around this sort of similar issue where it's like, we might not know with a percentage of certainty if this thing is likely to work, but we know with 100% certainty that what we're doing right now is not working. And so I think connecting it back to these kind of like broader ambitions and the whole imperative for what you're doing and why you're doing it, and that sort of like higher sorts of value can be a way of kind of connecting two values in a way that lets you work through that sort of like uncertainty and maybe not being significant and statistically relevant and those sorts of, because that's a tool for working through things that we don't know, right? It's like trying to kind of quantify it and say, well, we have more certainty now because we can define it within a neat little box. But I think I love that kind of connecting back to the values, and just saying what we do know is that what we're currently doing isn't working. So I love that way of reframing the statistics that Fiona had offered earlier. Great, lots of great resources in the chat. We'll be sending out links to all of these in the email for anyone that's not able to copy and paste. So please do not stress about that. We have a few minutes remaining. It feels like there's either time for one more question, if we keep it pretty short, or because we have such an engaged Zoom conversation and Zoom chat happening, maybe as we answer this last question, I'd love to invite those of you out there in Zoom land sitting around our metaphorical lunch table, if you'd be happy to just share a little bit about how this is landing with you, and maybe just like a few words reflection and how you're feeling at the end of our conversation, and to start thinking about that response as we start to conclude our lunchtime conversation. We would love for you to pop the just short reflection on how this is landing and what you're taking away in the Zoom chat. So as we start concluding, getting through four audience questions, but man, they're good ones. And there's more good ones below that we're not getting to just yet. So maybe we'll pick them up at a different date. The last question for today is, how do you establish an ethical model to encourage ownership and move past the temptation to mine people's stories for project and organizational benefit? And again, something that we've talked on. I can see Beth is already excited. Is there any, whoever asked this question, would you like to provide a little bit more context and come off mute for a moment?
Yes, I asked this question, and it's really, I work in mental health, and really wanting to bring people in, but wanting people to kind of still have a sense of ownership over their stories, because we know that in this space and lots of other spaces that stories can just become, I guess, those kind of confirming existing beliefs, and there's not necessarily space for any other kind of narratives, or even a sense of what people might want out of the experience of sharing their story themselves.
Such a great question, and there are so many layers to this. I think the first thing I would say is there are some great methodologies out there to drive inclusive storytelling. I instantly started thinking about co-design, which is a practice that has, I don't know if it has always been this way, but I feel like over time co-design has become more purposeful in the sense of being a way of working with people that aims to share power and is mindful of contexts in which there is a big power imbalance, and kind of finding ways to make sure that people who are sharing stories are also making decisions early on about the scope of the project, involved in planning how that storytelling is taking part. Yeah, some really great ideals and methods within co-design. I would say that's a really good place to look. I think the other thing I want to pick up on is just, Kathy, at the beginning, you said you were talking a bit about the space. And I think that's a really great place to begin, is actually awareness of the space that you have for storytelling. So, and I think there can be a really conscious offer to people as well to say, we are collecting stories because we want to use these stories to help improve X, or because we're trying to change Y. And this is sort of, this is the space that we have for you. There is an offer to engage here, but you also don't have to. It's an invitation to engage. And I think that's respectful also of, while we need to be really mindful of how we collect people's stories, I think there's also can be an awareness that people like to give their stories, and being heard and listened to is a really good thing. And without that, I think sometimes in some organizations, there can be fear around, sort of the risks involved in doing this type of work. but recognizing that there's a risk in not listening to people's stories and in not creating these types of spaces for people. So yeah, I'm pro story, and I think there are ethical ways of doing this. And you want to just be really mindful of the space that you do have to offer, and making sure that you're communicating really clearly about what that is, what that isn't, giving people choice within those spaces. There's a lot more nuance, I think, when you are looking at stories and you're working in spaces where there has been like a history of trauma, and those things are likely to come up for people. And there is an added layer of, I just want to say, like, preparation and responsibility that comes when you're entering one of those spaces deliberately. There's some great stuff around, like trauma responsive design is, I would still call an emerging practice, but a really great place to look at how you can make sure that you're setting your process up to be really respectful of people who may have had really difficult experiences, may not have fully processed those yet. Yeah.
I've got nothing more to add. I think you've said everything there, Beth. Thanks.
And thank you to everybody else who's also sharing in the chat. And thank you so much for everybody's questions. There are so many more questions that I feel like we could spend the rest of the afternoon here in conversation. But we do have, you know, the rest of the work to get to, although I think this is a big part of the sharing and the learning from each other. So thank you to everybody who spent your lunchtime or whatever time it is for you out there with us today in conversation. Thank you for the questions and the fantastic resources that were shared. Thea Snow, our director at CPI ANZ, has posted in the chat a little while back a link to some of the storytelling work we're working on and the future version 2 of the report, which will be coming up pretty soon. So for those of you who would like to stay in touch and see how some of this CPI work is progressing, I'll just put a link to join a bit of an online community of practice where we'll be sharing some updates as we go. And this is around reimagining government. For those of you who aren't already part of it, I know a large number of people found out about this event through that Slack. So good to see you all here in real life. And Beth and Emily, if there's any other way for people to stay in touch with the work that you're doing. I know Portable does a good job of writing up some of the work that's happening on the website and sharing that.
Yeah, I think that's probably the main place. I think you can follow Portable on LinkedIn as well. And I'm sure Em and I would welcome connections from people who are interested in this space as well.
Yeah, and just to say, I've mentioned Portable's website in the chat, so please do go there and check out our case studies, which are stories about the work that we do. And yeah, feel free to reach out. We'd love to connect. And thank you all so much for coming. That was really, really wonderful.
Thank you all. We'll be sharing the recording, the resources shared, and maybe at a future date, a bit of a Medium post or a co-authored blog based on some of the themes and insights coming out of this conversation today. So thanks for helping make it so rich. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I'm gonna end. Nope.